And that's it. John?
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Jonathan Magen, and I really love computers. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Google for having us, the AngularJS team for putting this together, and also to my employer, WeWork, for sponsoring my activities and shenanigans. Today, I want to talk to you about using Angular and Rails, as well as to tell you about how we do that at WeWork. How many of you have heard of WeWork? How many of you have been there, maybe, ever? Okay, you should certainly come by. It's a very cool place. I'll tell you a bit about it. So just first, a bit about me. My name is Jonathan. I go by Yankeltron basically everywhere else. We've probably interacted on IRC. I spend I'm at work all day, so that's good. But I hang out in a lot of channels as well, and that's really great. I've had a lot of wonderful teachers over the years. I just want to say thank you to them, but also to say thank you to WeWork for allowing me to become an engineer there. WeWork started as a co-working space with this idea that we were going to start off by changing the way that people work. In reality, it grew to a lot more than that, as it came to encompass more than just the space, but it also came to encompass the way that we do things. So these principles of we want to change the way people work, and also that we wanted to design to make people happy, we take those principles as mandates and we try to apply them first in our own work and then extend that opportunity to our members. So we now have 7 buildings in 3 cities with over 4,000 members, and we hope to grow significantly this year. We also provide a lot of services for our members. For instance, if you're self-employed or you have a small company, we have a healthcare plan which can help you get started and get on your feet, etc. We also have a wonderful community management staff who runs events, etc. Really, really wonderful people. It's a pleasure, a privilege to work there. So as to computing at WeWork, there have been some changes going on in the last 5 months. About 4 months ago, the WeWork upper management decided that they wanted to put together a crack engineering team and brought some of the most talented human beings. Wave, guys. Yeah, come on, wave. Yeah. And I get to work with them all day, which is really, really wonderful. And we've got some nice things that we do, and we've been trying to improve as we go. The tech stack at WeWork, we're a Rails shop. How many of you are also Rails users? Anybody? Yeah, more people. Okay, so that's really good. We also deploy to Heroku. Anybody else? Who's pissed about that Dino Mesh thing? Anybody? All right, maybe you didn't see that. So, and we also use Postgres as our backend, along with about 1 million other add-ons, because that's how it works with Heroku. We also try to practice Agile. How many people try to practice Agile, or at least say that they practice Agile? Okay, good. So we're trying to do more than just say that we practice Agile. We're trying really hard to actually do Agile. And I hear some chuckles, so you know that doesn't always happen the way that you'd hope. We've got 2 major engineering initiatives underway right now at WeWork. The first, our WeWork.com member network, a wonderful application designed not at the individual level, but at the business and the company level to bring together all the people on every floor, all the floors in every building, all the buildings in every city, and every city in the WeWork family. And we want to do this and provide opportunities to our member companies to network, to meet about one another. We have televisions up. I should have brought a picture of a TV. We have televisions up by every elevator bank so that you can see who's talking about what. We have a QR code so you can join into that conversation. And that's been really, really successful. The second thing, the one that I work on, we've named Spaceman, short for Space Management. And it's our new back office thing. Eventually, we hope that this will take over all billing, all space management, as the name implies, also reservations, integration with our accounting and ERP platform, as well as we hope that it will grow to eventually take in data from our building sensor network so that we can conserve energy, so that we can find out who uses what conference rooms when and equip them with the best equipment and provide quality of service to everybody. Key swipe so we can keep our buildings safer, things like that. We really hope that Spaceman will become the nexus for all of those improvements which come, as well as the data analysis opportunities which come afterwards. So Spaceman's interesting because we've been using Spaceman as our test bed for Angular. And things we've built with Angular have been very, very exciting. We built an audit trail and a changelog inspector using the audited gem. Has anybody used the audited gem on Rails? Okay, you should check it out. It's by Collective Idea. If you need a very hard record level audit trail, changelog, etc., audited is a great choice. We used Angular to build the inspector for that, the entire front end. That's really great. Joselito, one of our wonderful developers, also implemented infinite scroll using will paginate, which people should know from the Rails world has basically become the de facto standard if you want to do pagination. So that's been really good. We also did inline edit, which we'll talk about a bit more as we go, and also lots of stuff using ng resource. So if you take one technical lesson away from this, and I hope that you get more than one, but I'll settle for one, I really want the Rails community to start doing their best to adopt Angular, because I think that they fit well together. I think that they fit really well together. So well, in fact, that I'm like super excited that I get the chance to scream it from the rooftops and tell it to the world. And I'm going to try to tell you why today. First, let's dive right in. This is a Rails controller. For those of you who haven't seen a Rails controller, this is a snippet. By the way, everything I'm showing you today is actual code from Spaceman on our staging environment right now. So this is the index action for our offerings. Controller. You can see that it's very, very simple. The thing I want to call your attention to, can you see my cursor up there? Yes? Yes, you can? OK, so this respond to block is really where the magic happens. When an agent makes a request that has a content type of HTML, Rails knows to return HTML. But the following line, when it makes a JavaScript request through Ajax, or whether you specifically request JSON as a format, it knows to respond with JSON. So because Rails gives you RESTful endpoints for free out of the box by default, that means that anything smart enough to consume those properly also gets the immediate benefit of that, which is very, very exciting. So here we've got active record, the object relational mapper used by Rails, which pulls data out of the database, serializes it into JSON, and ships it over to HTTP, which then brings us to the browser. Is everyone OK if I move off of this slide? All right, if I go too fast on the code, just holler at me. All right, so then on the client side, we have ng-resource. How many of you Angular folks have used ng-resource? OK, this thing makes my life complete. This encapsulates what you have here. This code encapsulates the entirety of the Ajax interaction between the browser and Rails right here. This is it. It should look kind of boring to you, and in fact, it is boring until you realize what it does under the hood. You can see that you have the ways to define default actions. You give it a URL here, and of course, you see ng-resource. By the way, one key point: ng-resource is another file you have to include. So if you go home tonight and you try to play with ng-resource and you go, it doesn't work, you have to remember that it's one more file to include. Trust me, it's not a big deal, and you'll be thankful that you used wget on one single file. So you can see here, we've got wonderful dependency injection with $resource after the dependency has been specified in the module up here. And it returns a resource object here with the path. This little @sign, these are default parameters which go into the URL. It does interpolation sort of like most web frameworks do. The little @sign means that property gets read from the model object. So what you really got here, just like on the server where you have your object relational mapper that produces the object that then speaks to your database in terms of persistence, now you have the same thing except that lives in the browser. So you can actually push more and more Rails functionality or more and more of your web applications functionality into the browser, which is what makes Angular so exciting because it gives you the opportunity to do that in a structured fashion and one that doesn't make you want to pull your hair out 3 months later when you come back to it and you go, what on earth was I thinking? Everybody okay if I move past this? Great. So we've been using Rails to actually render Angular template HTML in sort of a meta template engine. This has been really exciting and also sometimes trippy. Trippy. Wow, that was a Freudian slip. Tricky as well. But it's been such because you've got a templating system on top of another templating system. So you've got sort of a meta templating engine thing happening. Meta Angular or Mangular, because I tried to get too cute once and it didn't go well. Things that we've done with this, sometimes you may actually want to use this. They're actually very exciting. For permissions, only rendering parts of a template, because as we all know, one of the great things about Angular comes from the fact that it allows you to specify DOM templates declaratively. So if you don't have a directive in there, Angular never finds it, etc. I'll show you an example of that. Also, dynamically populating form select options. All Rails form helpers rock. If you've never at least looked at the Rails form helpers, they're very, very impressive. And it goes a long, long way toward trying to make your code better. Because for forms that might not change a lot or you need certain data depending on the user, you don't necessarily want to have static templates. And this gives you the opportunity to render them dynamically, which goes a very, very long way. And the crown jewel of this entire exercise was finding how well our internationalization API that Rails ships with out of the box works. For those of you who don't know, Rails' internationalization API is really, really wonderful because it allows you to define all of your strings, all of your nomenclature into one single file for every language. Now, for those of you who do practice Agile, know how quickly during early iterations of a software project, what happens? Names change a lot. So our wonderful project manager right over there has access to our locale file so that he can actually change the names of things going into the UI so that we don't have to, do a bunch of restructuring and search replace on the server. So it makes it very, very, very good when stakeholders say we shouldn't call it this, we should call it this. We can say, okay, no problem. And by shipping that, and I'll show you an example of that, by shipping that, it makes everything go really, really nicely. So here's an example of permission-driven rendering. Remember how I said that one of the things that we had built was the audit inspector? Okay, so one of the things that we have here, if the current user has the role auditor, right, then render this chunk. That's a little bit more logic than I like to have in templates. Some of you may turn your nose up, but the point we have here, we can control that. So that means that that Angular does not ask for data to which the user Angular does not ask for data that the user can't access, right? Because it doesn't even get that directive. So that also stops your logs from having a bunch of unauthorized errors in there as well. And that's really, really helpful. When debugging, it's also really helpful because if you're not sure what's broken something on your page, you can just turn off that role or something like that, and all of a sudden those errors go away, and you can take it apart piece by piece. Another key thing to remember here, we've got data ng app. We have pieces of Spaceman which we don't need Angular for. We're fine with the Rails CRUD out-of-the-box stuff. We didn't want to necessarily add extra overhead. But because Angular allows you to limit the influence of Angular to a specific part of the page, possibly even having multiple apps on one page, it means that when we need that richness, when we need that structure, when we need that opportunity to do something great, we have it only where we need it. So it's given us a tremendous amount of flexibility and also eased adoption. I highly recommend you check it out. For the internationalization API, the time when we have used this most has been with column headers. So here you can see that that in this case, the data ng app directive, right, has been put on the top level at that table. Some of you will also recognize table and table striped. We use Bootstrap for our yeah, everybody. Okay. So you can see that the table header has been rendered statically, and it gets rendered by Rails. So we've got offering human attribute name, and then you pass it the name of the attribute that you want humanized, and whatever that should look like in the UI gets put there automatically, which is what I was talking about. And then the actual table body, where the data lives, that data gets fetched asynchronously by ng resource, and then gets put into the page by Angular. So we have a nice data-driven workflow there. And it also means that your pages load very, very quickly, because you need only load the skeleton when Angular feels that it has become ready to actually go ahead and grab the data. It grabs that from a JSON API. So you see literally a 90% reduction in response time, even for rendering complex things, when you switch from rendering all the markup on the server, even with caching sometimes, to just going ahead and rendering that JSON. So there was one minor snag when we were going and rolling out Angular on Rails. Rails has a very, very good, but also very, very aggressive asset pipeline. And for those of you who've used it, you know that it does a wonderful job of asset minification. It integrates with things like Sass and Compass and all the goodies that you would want. Unfortunately, by default, the JavaScript compressor mangles all of your names. So that means that it breaks the dependency injection, which also helps to make Angular so wonderful and such a pleasure to use. So in order to do that, you can change the way that you write your Angular code. I was lazy, so I just toggled it off and figured that on the, that amortized over my entire application, I would have a few extra KB to deal with. So make sure that if you wanted to do that, you put this in your production.rb. So just to sum up this section, Angular on Rails, because Rails gives you RESTful JSON endpoints for free, and because ng resource lets you consume them for free, they dovetail so nicely together. They really, really do. I encourage you to try it with a web framework of your choice. Of course, we're partial to Rails as a Rails shop. And also, let Rails help you render templates. I'd be very interested to see if anyone else, you can approach me after something like that, if anyone else has done any of this meta template rendering. How many of you have ever written a Lisp macro? Probably not. Okay, so all right. So if you've written a Lisp macro, you understand why it's so exciting that you could maybe generate templates with templates. If you haven't, you think I'm nuts, and that's okay. So the accidental feature, one of the key parts here, I want to tell you about this time that I sat down to try something out, and in the course of an afternoon, accidentally did exactly what I set out to do, which I didn't think could happen, but apparently on the dream world where Angular comes from, it just sort of fits together. It started with a spike. For those of you who raised your hands saying that you try to practice Agile, you may recognize the term spike as something which describes a single prototype, a single technical prototype that you want to use for exploration of a concept, but which you eventually intend to throw away. You can compare and contrast this with the concept of a tracer bullet. A tracer bullet, you want to come up with a prototype that maybe touches multiple parts of your architecture, but that you eventually intend to keep. In this case, we did something we did something that when we went in, we thought we knew we wanted to eventually throw away. So the requirement initially was to allow a user to quickly inline edit inventory on the index page. This is an actual Spaceman wireframe, which was put together with a lot of help from our wonderful product manager, Joseph DiPenuta. And you can see here, this should look very, very familiar to most of you, this sort of user interface metaphor. How many of you have ever done inline edit? Okay, so there are a lot of ways to do it. And we figured, because we knew that we would need richness later on, we wanted to go ahead and pick something with which we knew we were familiar. Everyone on the team had at some point or another done inline edit, and we wanted to see what that would look like with Angular. And this turned out that this was actually really hard to figure out how to get started. This was quite painful. And we weren't really sure why. And this almost turned us off of Angular because it seemed like something so simple, right? In regular JavaScript terminology, you can see and you can think about, well, how might I want to do this? You want to do certain types of DOM manipulation. You want to have events, etc. But Angular frees you from a lot of that and allows you to write things in a more structured fashion. So it took us some time to figure out how we were going to do that. We know full well that we could have done this, maybe in a better way, using a more well-understood approach, but that would defeat the purpose. There were plenty of jQuery plugins which did this. There were also Ruby gems which shipped everything you needed and was completely opaque to us as the developer, which, by the way, always leads to problems later on. So we were hesitant to use those solutions as well. There was a great Google Groups thread, which I've linked to. I'll try to put these slides up on SlideShare or something. There was a great Google Groups thread about inline edit, which we used to help get started. That research was very valuable. The other piece of research was a great Stack Overflow thread. One thing I will say in praise of the Angular community, when people ask questions, people give answers with code. And I hope that everyone appreciates this, and I hope that you've never actually had to work in a community or work with a framework where people who answer questions, assuming they answer questions, don't necessarily provide working code snippets in a JS Fiddle or a Plunker or what have you, but that was key in getting us off the ground. So again, we know that we would eventually need Angular, and we wanted to ease our way in gradually. So there weren't too many options out there. There was one option that we found specifically related to tables, and that was ng-grid. And we ended up turning ng-grid down for a few reasons. How many of you have seen the Angular UI project, for those of you who have done it? Right, very exciting. How many of you have seen ng-grid? Because I hadn't seen that one before. Okay, so all right, a few of you. So we ended up saying no to ng-grid for a few reasons. One, it re-implemented the table in terms of divs, which led to the wonderful but also horrible condition known as divitis, wherein divs take over your entire page and then come to your home at night and steal the food out of your fridge because there are divs everywhere and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's awful. ng-grid also does way more than we needed to do. We were setting out for inline edit. If you need string templates to conditionally format or maybe even colorize each individual cell on your table based on its contents, ng-grid might work really, really well for you. It did a lot more than we wanted. And this was a sub-project of the Angular UI, which we sort of assessed was potentially even risky. It was potentially even risky because the status of the Angular UI project in the context of the larger Angular community has remained a little bit nebulous. It's kind of unclear where it stands. And it uses a lot of things from other projects in ways that, maybe made us a little bit uncomfortable. And once again, hid quite a few details from us. And, okay, so I imagine everyone in here has had to debug a problem that only exists on one browser and not on the other. When those details get hidden, we needed a way to remain confident that we knew what we were doing and what we wanted to do. And Angular UI didn't really give us that. So we ended up turning it down on a multitude of reasons. In all honesty, if I had to offer one criticism from this, I think that Angular could really use widgets. I think that it would aid adoption. Maybe it means making Angular UI a proper piece, a top-level project, just like ng-resource doesn't necessarily ship by default, but you can get it. Maybe an independent widget set. I think that would really, really go a long way. How many of you have been following the development of web components? Okay, if you have not been looking at web components, go home tonight, you'll thank me later, and read the latest W3 draft on web components. It was released within the last week or so, and it describes a proposed methodology for bundling self-contained widgets, including their own styling, their own templates, their own application logic, etc., and even up to and including declaring a custom element, much in the way that you've seen Angular has been able to do. So in that sense, it really makes you feel like Angular is kind of importing features from the future of the web and giving it to you now. But now that we have this framework in front of us and people have been talking about what widgets might look like, how they might get styled, etc., I want to start that now. I just, I don't know how. But anyway, there you have it. So how we ended up doing it was actually quite simple because it turned out that the tools were all there already. And this was how the accidental feature was developed. So you should remember our Rails controller with the example of the offerings, right? That was that. This here we have up here, we have this wonderful example. It's very short, doesn't do a whole lot because we didn't need it to do a whole lot. This is our Angular controller for offerings. You can see that we have dependency injection here. This query thing, offering.query, that's ng resource. That knows what to do. It goes, it fetches the JSON, it populates your wonderful collection of objects. It does those wonderful things for you and does them all so that you don't need to worry about it. So with one line, we have made our request. It returns values when it's ready. Angular knows to do that as part of its wonderful watch and apply bits. My only criticism of ng resource right now, and I know that this will have been solved by the time that 1.2 or 1.1 or 1.2 comes out. What's in beta right now? 1.2. Okay, so when 1.2 gets released, I was very excited to see that ng resource will have the promise API. That it will return promises. Right now, it doesn't do that. So then we have a function here, editing toggle, which is really kind of simple. It takes an offering. If the offering has been put into the editing state, that means that the editing property has a truthy value. It updates it. And update, again, was that method that we defined earlier when we defined our ng resource bit. I showed you that at the beginning. I can go back at the end. And it sets editing to false after updating it. And if not, then it sets editing to true. So it basically inverts it. It negates that, saving if necessary. That's the entirety of the controller. Now let's look at what the templates look like. Please recall earlier that we rendered statically using the internationalization API the top of the table. Let's look at what the data looks like for the table body. And you'll see the first cell in every table row there. So here you can see table row data ng repeat, right, for offering in offerings. And we have our first TD, our first cell in the table there. And what we did was we used ng show. An ng show allows you to give an expression, and when that expression evaluates to something truthy, it will show it. When it does not evaluate to something truthy, it will hide it. Very complicated. This is what we have. So here we have this link, right, that has a link, and when ng show says that offering.editing is false, so the negation of offering.editing, it shows it. So that's the default, because by default, nothing gets put into an editing state. This input here shows the inverse. So we have set up a situation where the display gets shown or the edit component gets shown, but never both at the same time. That was how we used it. Everybody okay here? The templates are hard to see. I couldn't get the color scheme for markup to look not terrible. Okay, and that was it. So once we got this working, which took about an afternoon, we had everything that we needed to go. We had the UI components that were taken care of. We made them all declarative. We didn't even have to write a directive. We didn't have to write a filter. We didn't have to write in anything that we didn't want to write because it did it out of the box. When it was in display mode, it showed the display stuff. When it was in edit mode, it showed the edit stuff. And saving, loading, and everything in between was taken care of for us by ng resource, which in turn then made us feel very, very taken care of. So it worked. It worked better than we had anticipated, and so we kept it. A minor deviation from agile practice, but we were pretty excited around the office. This approach did have a few problems, and those problems have remained with us right now. One, it's very, very verbose. for every field, according to that record, what type of field. If you want to have any edit piece there, you need to declare it specifically. You have to set up the select. You have to set up the edit box, or set the type on that if you want to use those nice HTML5 form controls, what have you. You have to do that yourself, which leads to the next problem, that it is soaking wet, not dry at all, a ton of repetition, a ton of redundancy, stuff that you just don't need, stuff that you just don't want. And that leads to our third issue, which is that it makes it very, very hard to reuse. So even though we've come up with a pattern that we feel comfortable with and that works pretty well, it's very, very hard when we want to go ahead and turn this into a directive, or even come up with a way to make Rails render that properly to do all of this. So if anybody's got feedback about that, I'd really like to hear if you've done inline edit, if you've done anything like this, and tips you've used in general for turning things that you've built into reusable components, and of course then following the Angular way. And that really about wraps it up for the next steps in inline edit. We really need to turn this into something that we can use elsewhere. That was only one snippet of a wireframe, but the inline edit user interface metaphor gets used a lot, and people like it, and it works. So we have many other places where we really, really, really want to use inline edit, but we can't do everything by hand every time for reasons you already know. It becomes brittle, it becomes hard to maintain, it becomes tough to change, all of those things combined. How am I doing on time? Can I go ahead and show some more, or do we want to?
Keep going.
Keep going. Yeah, man. So this accidental success that we had, this craziness where things just sort of came together, actually led to a lot of really beautiful things happening at WeWork. There was about a, what would you say, guys, a 48-hour, 72-hour period where we were just so jazzed on Angular. And it was like, man, Angular's falling from the sky. We were wrong. It was snow, but it was still really great. And everything went perfectly, and this led to us trying a bunch of other things and doing these wonderful experiments, and everyone was really happy. I want to show you that audit inspector. Because we have an application which will handle billing and will handle money, and we need to make sure that we deliver customer success and a consistent experience, we also have to have a very, very strong audit trail, which was why we turned to the audited gem, which I mentioned. Again, that was a project out of collective idea. It works very, very well. It gives you record-level change control and change tracking for any model that you want. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. On the top, you can see our Rails model. We have that one little line up there that says audited. That's all you need to drop in. And on every change, the data structure down below gets dumped into a table, which you can track. So the downside, of course, your auditing table gets very, very, very big because you have a ton of audits every time you go ahead and manipulate it. Indexes help to negate that, but it also means that even if you delete a record because you don't have soft delete implemented, you still have the changelog, and you can actually reconstruct that object in the database. So here you can see it's got really nice things like the user ID and username, so you can see who actually changed it. It has the action, whether it was a create or an update or a delete, so you know where that audit trail begins and ends. And also you have this wonderful diff in there in audited changes, which gives you a hash of before and after, so you can see what the value was before and what it was after. So this is what one of our show pages looks like for an offering, and that same thing that we showed you. By the way, at the end, if you'd like to see, I can show you all this is live locally. I can show you some of that. So here we have our offering, and up in the top corner, you see we have a changelog button. That's put there conditionally. If you have the ability to view auditing data, then that directive gets rendered to prevent Angular from asking for data to which it does not have access. So if you click that changelog button, it goes ahead and it opens this nice table. The who column is empty because we're still overhauling, and when I say overhauling, I mean writing for the first time our role and permission system for this, because it's a very, very new project. So that will eventually have usernames, possibly emails. We'll decide. It shows what it was, it shows when it happened, and it gives you that nice little option to inspect. When you click on that inspect icon, again, Bootstrap, when you click on that, you get a nice display done with Angular, which shows what the before and after values were. So here you can see the price was changed from 0 to 3.14. A bunch of the locations were changed. We still need to work out how we want to go ahead and map named database identities in, but surely we're not the only person to have that problem. I imagine that everybody who does fun stuff on the front end also has that problem. But maybe Rails meta template rendering can help us out there. I really hope so. Yeah, so that's the end of it. I just want to thank the Angular core team for putting this together. Again, thank Google, and also thank WeWork. And really, I want to thank you for coming. Yeah. it would be my pleasure to take any questions that you might have.
So just wait for mics real quick.
Hey, I just had a couple questions, actually. The first was about the templating. I have a friend who had actually written an app using Rails and Backbone, and I was suggesting he move to Angular because a lot of the code could be written a lot less verbosely. But he was having difficulty throwing out the Rails templates he already wrote, and I saw a lot of duplicated templates. I just wanted to know how you handled whether to render the page in HTML first using Rails, or whether to render most of it on the client side.
That's a really good question, and something that we actually had quite a bit of discussion about, not only before we started, but also as we went through it. Because the templates will eventually live in the DOM, Angular takes the sensible approach that you should specify them in the DOM, and you should do it declaratively. So if you want to render HTML templates, you should use the tools that you have available to render those templates. Whereas using Backbone and the asset pipeline, etc., for shipping templates using, what is it, Sprockets now is the default in Rails. That'll actually give you a global, which you can access templates by name and then render them. So if you've never used Backbone on Rails, you'll want to go ahead and look at that. But you don't need to do that anymore. You don't need that workaround. You don't have to specify it in a separate file, and that actually helps you when you go to hand it to your designers, because it looks like the final product only with one row, which is a key thing, because you don't need to have your designers know Angular in order to then go ahead and add style to your page, which allows you to parallelize those tasks. So you don't have any waste when you're waiting for one group to finish building the application, and then they hand it off to the UI department just in time for your stakeholders to come back and give you very, very valuable, but also destructive to the work you just did, feedback. So that's a really good question.
Okay, and the second one real quick was with internationalization. Did you handle it entirely on the back end? Because we're working on a project right now where we're doing the internationalization almost entirely on the front end. And we found that we had to manually bootstrap Angular in order to get it to localize correctly. And it wasn't as easy as we thought it might be.
First of all, that sounds awesome, but then you got to the part where it was troublesome, and that sounds pretty terrible. I haven't had the need to do that. I don't think that we will. I think that we're pretty comfortable with rendering that stuff on the back for right now. But if it comes up again, I have a card somewhere here. Please take it. I will. Yeah, I would love to see any work that you've that you've done. I know that there have been a few JavaScript libraries which have been released that attempt to do internationalization, or at least mimic the wonderfulness of the Rails inflector for pluralization and stuff like that. Some of them look very, very, very promising, and that's probably where I would start looking. Those people seem very intelligent.
Thank you.
For getting your data on the client side, you're fetching that all via Ajax after the page is loaded?
Correct.
Okay. Is there, have you looked into ways, or is there any desire to bootstrap it by sending through script tags or something? Or is that a common pattern? Is that a common pattern at all? Or
yeah, we don't want to do that. Doesn't mean we couldn't, but we don't want to do that for the following reason. Remember how I mentioned that we have this not-so-secret dream that Spaceman will come to become this nexus for all of this data. We want to immediately start to become a client of our own APIs and start to get those issues out of the way. And Angular gives us the opportunity to do that on a very small scale by consuming our own JSON endpoints, which is a very, very valuable thing. I don't even know what that would look like with Angular to put it in script tags, but I mean, it seems like a neat experiment. Maybe we should do that just to see what it looks like. Or not, because that's unethical and against the Angular way. We're doing it. Anybody else? We have one back there.
I just want to follow up on localization. I want to be clear. Are you using Ajax to get your tokens, or are you just rendering the page on the server side?
We render the page server-side in a skeleton, and then we have Angular get all the actual data. So the canonical example actually has been the best use case for that, table headers. Right? So the table headers, we don't need Angular to render. All the data in it, we totally, need Angular to render. So that's what we do.
So it's an Ajax call, gets back the tokenized...
The data, it gets back the actual data. So we don't do We don't do localization at the data entity level. We only do it at the UI strings and actual templates level. So if somebody puts English into the database model, English will come out. But if you want to have the entire UI get translated into Hebrew or Korean or any other interesting language that uses a different character set, the Rails Internationalization API can help you with that.
Okay.
So I also look forward to seeing how Angular handles Unicode in templates, et cetera. I think it'll do pretty well because I think it'll do as well as your browser does. That seems like the reasonable assumption. Anything else?
Question in the back.
So I was curious, since you're rendering on the server side, does that mean when you actually navigate once you've loaded in the page, are you doing a reload, or when you navigate to another section of your UI, are you using Angular to actually do a refresh of the page? I imagine that every URL can actually be refreshed and loaded as is, but I'm wondering whether you're reloading every time you go to another section or just using Angular.
That was exactly the right question to ask, and I'll tell you why. That was the right question to ask because a major discussion during adoption of Angular was, do we have to implement the entire front end in terms of Angular? And as I said, Angular allows you to restrict Angular's activities to one part of the page or possibly multiple parts of the page. So yes, in that respect, we do need to do a refresh. However, that does not become computationally or I/O expensive, considering the fact that you need only serve up the skeleton. And following the serving up of the skeleton, Angular grabs the rest of it over JSON, which has been very, very, very performant. And we look forward to doing more benchmarking on that. It basically becomes as performant as you can grab the data, possibly even if you cache at your database layer, serialize that into JSON, which is very quick because that happens using the C extensions, and then send it over the wire, which is as fast as your wire goes. So yeah.
Any more questions?
Super, guys. Thanks. Oh, wait.
Have you seen any, in terms of accessibility with Angular, a lot of Ajax frameworks, you're just going to create the elements in the DOM dynamically. So if they're not there, you're not worried about them showing up for sort of accessibility purposes. With Angular, you already have that first row there, except it's empty. Have you seen any do you have any insight about accessibility with Angular?
Not right now. But I know that there was talk of embedding the new microdata stuff. The people at schema.org have been doing some really wonderful work in embedding markup sort of as the successor to microformats, which some of you might remember. And microdata uses the new HTML5 item scope stuff to allow you to do that. So when we go to do that, that's very, very interesting. Let's talk about that after, because, cool, man, cool.
Igor has a question.
Hey, yeah. Hi, this is Igor. I have a quick question regarding the inline editing. Have you looked into using content editable instead of the way you were implementing the inline editing?
He's good. No, but I know what I'm doing tonight. Hearts.
So content editable is something that we played with before. Because people asked about this and people try to do inline editing in their apps. So there have been several questions about this on the mailing list. And we showed some examples of how you can use content editable, how you can implement a directive for content editable. And it's actually something that could be included into Angular core. It's just a matter of writing the code and polishing it and writing all the tests. So if you want to have a fun project and get some of your code included into AngularJS, then this is something that you can work on.
I see what you did there. Let me put it this way. When you get something out there, we'll gladly help test it, and we'll probably find bugs because we have some very, very aggressive initial stakeholders. So yeah, I would love to follow up with you about that afterwards. That sounds very cool. Thank you for extending that opportunity.
SEO, have you explored it all?
No, because this application will not face the public. Right now, it's almost exclusively back office. Eventually, it will come to pass, as I said to the person who asked about the refreshes, etc. and also about embedding data in the DOM. Eventually, our most aggressive clients and our heaviest consumers of data from our own APIs will actually become other systems. They'll become other things in the WeWork ecosphere that need to consume data that comes out of Spaceman. So because of that, most of the time when a user goes ahead and tries to look at data from Spaceman, they'll see it through one of our other applications, which makes an API call behind the scenes. So we have nothing to say about SEO on that, subject.
It looked like to me that you didn't use Jade as part of your framework. Did you use Jade or did you not use Jade?
No, we use ERB.
And then also, it's recommended that you split up the JavaScript file into multiple files. Did you keep it all in multiple files, or did you put it into one?
So we started with one, and then we're like, hey, nobody got time for that. So then we split it up into other things, and that actually works well because Rails has a phenomenal asset pipeline. So you can structure things however you want, and it gets minified correctly. The only time when that happens, if you declare a dependency that might get put in the wrong order or something. I think we had one thing early on, but that was probably our fault because I know that Angular waits for the right opportunity to do the right thing, as we all should. We good? It's very web scale. Yes, there was a question about if it's web scale. It has at least a kilorofl per second. That's the moneymaker question right there.
Hi. Have you ever had a situation where your editable field is something more complex than just a text field?
We have selects, and selects were kind of a pain. There's actually a ticket in Jira with my name on it right now for our inline edit, which I can show you live if you'd like, where our inline edit renders the select box. The change gets saved, but because the ID and the value for that option does not map cleanly to the name of that option, that doesn't get refreshed. That's probably also something that I'm doing wrong. If anyone has done that, I'd like to know how you did it, because so.
Selects can be tricky.
Yeah,
I dealt with that.
Yeah.
I'll chat with you after.
Yeah, good. I'd like that.
Any other questions? Anybody? Awesome. Thank you.
Igor, who are you?
Who am I? Hi, I'm Igor. I'm Igor. I'm on the AngularJS team. I'm the team lead of our sweet little project. I work from Mountain View here in the Google office.
When can we expect the Angular beta to become the Angular stable?
Tough question to begin with. So we are waiting for animations to land. That is the last major feature we're waiting for. It's at the state where we are hoping to get it merged this week. So once that happens, we want to cut at least one release to just have people play with this feature, give us some feedback, and once everything's good, we're going to call that 1.2. Sounds good?
He looks satisfied. And another question.
Hi, I was just wondering, before Angular came about, what were some of the frameworks you guys looked at, or you looked at as inspiration, or something that you looked at and said, this is almost what I want, but it's not quite there. I'm going to start something else.
Well, Angular started a long time ago. It was 4 years ago almost when the initial version started. And it didn't start as a framework at all. It started as a service that would allow non-programmers build web applications with nothing but HTML and CSS. And it was only later on that we realized, hey, this would be a really sweet way of actually building web applications as a web developers, not as hobby website makers. So our inspirations definitely come from the server side. And since Angular was not meant to be a framework 4 years ago, we were not really inspired by any of the client-side frameworks that existed at that time. But at that time, there were very few, and maybe Dojo and XJS and maybe 2 or 3 more. But that was about it.
Thanks.
Another question here. Do you want to grab this mic?
Hello. When building large web applications, should we use require.js with Angular?
So to answer that question, if you have lots of third-party dependencies, then require.js can help you. If you don't have many third-party dependencies, then require.js is not going to help you that much because the way the dependency system, the DI system works in Angular, it doesn't depend on loading code in any particular order, as long as all the code is loaded by the time the application bootstraps. So I would really look at the dependencies, and if you have many third-party non-Angular dependencies, then look into using require.js. If you don't have any of that, then require.js will just complicate things, most likely.
Cool. Okay, so the first question on the moderator is best practices for initializing bootstrapping a AngularJS app in a part of the page. Can you see the moderator queue, Igor?
I have a separate window open. So yeah. So if you know about ng app, that's the way you can declaratively bootstrap an application. So you can use that in bootstrap application for the whole page using like putting ng app on the HTML element in your page, or you can just use it to bootstrap part of the page as an Angular application. If you want to do it lazily in response to some event or AJAX, then you can use imperative API angular.bootstrap, which is what is actually being used by ng app to bootstrap the application. So just look at angular.bootstrap API, and that will show you how to bootstrap application programmatically, and you can just do it anytime you want, and you can specify which piece of DOM is your Angular application.
By the way, for folks here who are doing mobile development, a similar solution is great for folks who are doing mobile development and want to bootstrap, say, if they're using PhoneGap and they want to wait for the device to be ready, just hit the bootstrap call.
Yeah, and you can also use it with script loaders. If you're using script loaders that asynchronously load scripts, then ng app is not going to work for you, and that's when Angular Bootstrap is handy. And PhoneGap is the same scenario.
Cool. Next question is what changes to DOM APIs?
So DOM and JavaScript. JavaScript definitely object observe, which is what will allow us to do DOM manipulation, do data binding and model mutation observation in a more efficient way. So object observe is very hot. From DOM APIs, it will be the web components. Specifically, I'm really excited about the Shadow DOM. As Jonathan mentioned, if you don't know anything about components, just check it out and see what kind of new possibilities this will bring. Yeah, those are the two. On JavaScript, I'm also excited about argument destructuring that will come with ECMAScript 6. It looks really nice, and I think it will bring a brand new wave of API possibilities in JavaScript.
What would be good resources to learn AngularJS directive best practices? I just want to answer that question before Igor does. We have awesome Meetup videos on that. But you can go ahead, Igor.
Yes, there is a video. I suppose there are actually several videos. One is Mishko created one. Mishko recorded one here in Mountain View, and he just went really deep into directives and how it all works. There is a whole bunch of applications, including the FoodMe app that we used at some of the conferences as workshops. So just search for FoodMe app, and there are some really good directives that you can learn from. And there are also some really sweet books coming out. One written by Brad Green, and the other one is written by Pavel Kozlowski and Peter Bacon-Darwin. So there are at least two books that cover directives, and you can already get them, and they are in the preview stage right now, but you can get access to those.
Cool. We have a local question.
Is there any way to, are there any plans for Angular to manage kind of a say of different translations for localization in addition to handling the pluralization? And is there any better way to kind of dynamically change the locale rather than loading all of the locales or manually bootstrapping the app after you load a specific one?
You definitely shouldn't load all of the locales at once and then just picking one at runtime. That's not very efficient. As was mentioned by Jonathan, using Rails as your backend is a nice way to get localization of strings for almost for free. There are some other ways to do it. Here at Google, we have internal infrastructure that we leverage for this, but basically what it does, it just consumes all of the templates, the HTML templates that contain English strings, and these strings are marked as something that is translatable, and it will extract all these strings and create key value pairs of identifiers and the strings, which are then sent to translators, and they'll translate it and send back, again, key value pairs in different locales. And then what we do is we pre-generate templates in different locales, and based on the user setting, we serve the locale in a given, we serve the template in a given locale. So we have a French template for the application, we have German template for the application, and all the other locales, and that's what we serve. I don't think that doing this on the client side makes a whole lot of sense, because it's not going to perform really well, and it's going to cause a lot of flicker. We kind of experimented with this and just ended up just doing it on the server side, and we find that as a better solution. But as I mentioned, we have an internal infrastructure for this that we leverage, and outside of Google, the best thing the thing that comes closest to what we have at Google is the Rails as pipelines. If anybody's interested in starting a project that would create a backend independent solution, then come to the mailing list and we can discuss that.
Thanks.
Cool. So next question is, I've only dabbled with Angular. Persisting data best practices didn't seem to be covered in the framework tutorials. Is that intentional?
I don't know. I don't think that's really true. We definitely try to show the communication with as much as possible. Angular tries to be backend agnostic, so that we build Angular so that you can hook it up with any kind of backend. As was mentioned during today's presentation, just using ng resource with the Rails backend works quite well, and there are many other backends that you can use ng resource with. So we consider ng resource to be a good answer to just talking to the server and handling server-side persistence. We don't currently ship with anything that would deal with local storage or any kind of storage that is in the browser, but this might change in the future.
Cool. We have a local question.
Yeah. Are you planning to use DOM mutation events to perhaps enable something like dynamic directive injections?
Mm-hmm. Possibly. It's a possibility that we're exploring. We're still not sure that we have all the flexibility that is needed, because right now you need to imperatively invoke the template compiler to tell it, hey, this is a new fragment of DOM that needs to be compiled. The DOM mutation events could automate this so that you don't need to invoke the Angular compiler by yourself and it just happens automatically. We're looking into that, but we're nowhere close to just throwing this into the core yet. But the DOM mutation observers is a very interesting feature, and if we don't use it for the compilation, there are many other places where we can still leverage the feature in future versions of Angular.
So next question on the queue is, are there any plans to add better hooks for animating view changes, and/or are there any current best practices?
Yes, there is a pull request that has been pending for a couple of weeks now, and as I mentioned, we're getting to the point where it's almost ready to be merged. There are a few more things that still needs to be polished. And with this change, we'll have animations for pretty much everything, for ngView, for repeaters, for switch, for basically everything where a chunk of DOM comes and leaves. And we implemented it in a way that will allow you to define your own animations. So we'll have some basic animations that we'll ship with by default. But if you're not happy with those, if you want to do something crazy on your own, this will be completely extensible, and you'll have full control over how the animation will work.
Great. What is Bower? How does AngularJS use it?
Bower. I don't work on Bower. I just tell people what they need to fix in Bower. But Bower is it's a repository of client-side JavaScript libraries that you might want to use on your project. Just think of NPM or RPM or any of the package management system that are out there for different platforms. There really isn't one that is used by everybody for the client-side libraries. And what Bower does, it's a repository of all these possible libraries that contains information about dependencies between different libraries. And what it allows you to do is you can just specify, oh, my project needs Angular, and it needs, some Angular, let's say D3 plugin. And Bower will figure out, oh, this plugin also needs D3 for it to do its work. So I also need to install that. So it's this way of resolving dependencies for components in your application. And how Angular is associated with this, we have Angular in the Bower repository. So if you are using Bower, you can just do Bower install Angular, and it's going to pull Angular from the Bower repository, and it's going to install it into your application.
Cool. What do you see as the biggest pain points in Angular?
You tell me. Is this from like perspective of somebody who develops Angular or somebody who uses Angular to build applications? That's quite not clear.
Is Aiden Feldman here?
I guess from us, from the users.
From the user's perspective.
I think it's getting around to understanding how directives work and their full power is quite tricky for many users, just because it's a completely different way of building web apps and just thinking about how to structure applications. So if we could come up with a easier way to explain directives, I think that would simplify the process of getting started with Angular by quite a bit. But there are many things that I would like to improve on Angular, and we are slowly going through the list and fixing things up. But if you have something concrete that has been bothering you for a while, just let me know, and I'll see if we can do something about it.
Cool. Are you hoping for a community around Angular-specific plugins, widgets, or or that it should be flexible enough to bring in other jQuery, Bootstrap, whatever plugins?
That's a good question. So I think it really depends on. These are actually, I think, two questions. So the one question is, should we rebuild many of the widgets without the existing dependencies? And the other one is, should the community do it? So I think yes, this is a place where community can help, and this is where I see community already helping. Just look at the Angular Bootstrap project. That's a very good example. So what the Angular Bootstrap guys are doing, they're just taking the Twitter Bootstrap and rewriting all of the JavaScript into Angular code. They looked into, could we just wrap it and reuse the JavaScript code that already ships with Twitter Bootstrap, and just wrap it into Angular directives so that you can just use it as Angular components. But they realized along the way that just rewriting this in plain JavaScript with all the Angular idioms is much faster and makes the code half the size, or sometimes even less. So yes, community can help, and often it makes sense to just rewrite stuff instead of wrap existing stuff. Especially if you look at many of the jQuery UI plugins. I'm not saying that all of them, but many of them are not of the highest quality, and just wrapping that into another layer of Angular stuff just makes things more complicated than it needs to be.
Is there a roadmap available for future releases? Where do you come up with this awesome release names?
We're preparing a blog post about the roadmap, which should go out, I think, this week. So we're gonna describe this in detail there. And regarding the names, it's just something that we started, when we started cutting releases of Angular, we just felt like we needed a theme. And that's when we decided that it should be something superpower related, and it should be 2 words, and it should be awesome or quirky. And that's when we just started thinking about crazy names, and we got suggestions from our colleagues, and so it's either somebody in the team that comes hey, this sounds awesome, let's just use it, or often our users just send us email hey, I came up with this awesome code name, do you want to use it? And if it sounds good, we'll take it.
What is the purpose of the controller in the directive, and when do you use one? Some people have mentioned using it for community across directives, but for communicating across directives. But for communication can be done through the use of services. Can you explain this concept?
Right. So the controllers in directives, they are meant to be used for communication between multiple components. A good example of this is the tabs example that is on the website of AngularJS.org. And there you can see how we have the tabs component and pane component. And what the pane component does, it says it needs to talk to the tabs component. And the way it talks to the tabs component is by getting hold of the reference to the tabs component controller. And then it can register itself with it and can do other stuff. Why not use services for this? The reason for that is that services, there is typically just one instance of a particular service per application. So the scoping is wrong. You want to, for example, in the pane example, the pane wants its direct parent tabs controller, not any random tab controller. So it's mainly about scoping and getting hold of the right instance.
Local question.
Are there any plans for asynchronously loading controllers the way we do with templates? Maybe a controller URL in the router?
Yes, we already implemented some enhancements to the dependency injection system, which allows us to do lazy code loading. And this is something that hasn't been merged to the master branch yet, but it's something that is quite close to being there. So this will allow you lazy load code, including controllers.
A/B testing. What approach have you taken?
One of the Googlers here actually approached me regarding A/B testing, and he suggested that we could build a generic service that would make A/B testing with Angular easy. I haven't thought about this much, but it's with dependency injection and like all these low components we have in Angular. A/B testing is not that difficult to do. We just don't have any guidelines or best practices yet because we haven't done much of this.
What's your opinion of the Angular UI router? Is this or something similar something that has the potential to be included in Angular core in the future?
I've been following the project. There is some really good discussion about improvements to the routing system in Angular, and I'm supportive of this effort. I think it's going to take quite a while for the project to be mature enough for us to consider it as something that we would include in the core. But I think that our routing has some gaps, and this might be a project that will address them all and could be the replacement in the future of the main routing that we have in Angular today.
Is there a formal way or any need to distinguish models persisted data from objects properties that represent view state?
In the applications I've been working on, I haven't felt the need to distinguish the two. It's obvious how what is part of this like view model versus the application model, and the distinction is that you typically put this view model directly on the scope, whereas the application model is on the scope but has all these extra methods for persisting and communicating to the server side, which is something that the view model only model lacks. But I haven't had any like need to formally distinguish the two. I've seen some people try to do it, and I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I don't have any strong preferences in this area.
3 more questions. So, what is a good workflow for using Angular with Django? Sounds like another presentation.
I have no clue. I don't use Django, so I honestly don't know. But I expect it's going to be something similar to Rails, where you just write your templates in something that is processed by Django and served. I know that the main issue there is the collision between double curlies, which can be fixed either by reconfiguring Django or reconfiguring Angular so that you don't have double curlies being used in both places as a data binding.
Does any Django user here know?
Is Gabe here? No. Oh, there's a Django user that's going to volunteer. Yes.
Yeah, I got an app right now actually that's on beta and it's running with the Django backend. The distinguish issue is not really a big issue because all my templates are still coming from the JavaScript side. And then I just do, much like you would with Rails, I'm just making asynchronous calls using the HTTP object over to my Django server. And the URLs are mapped to different JSON responses that it'll make. So it's definitely a rich web format, not so much pages rendered on the server, but it works good, it works fast. I can show somebody if they're really interested.
Cool. Next question. Have you used alternative client-side MVC frameworks? What did you like or not like?
I tried a bunch of them. We always explore what else is out there. But for me, the two main goals with Angular is developer productivity and maintainability and testability of the code. And I often feel like all the other solutions are just falling short in these two areas.
Last question. I want to use AngularJS with GWT, GWT, which is Google's Java to JavaScript framework. Want the best of both worlds. Saw some code snippets posted by Ray Cromwell. So it would be great if we could get insights from the talk.
I haven't seen the talk, and I haven't built any GWT applications that use Angular. But there seems to be a growing number of people who are using the two together. So I would look at the mailing list and try to look at the archive discussion on this topic, or just asking on the mailing list if there's anybody who has more experience. But I keep on hearing that it's possible to mix the two. And but I don't have any best practices that I can share.
Any other questions in the audience? We do have a question.
When your animation comes out, are you going to leverage any of the hardware acceleration like CSS transitions can?
So the way the animations are actually implemented, they allow you to either leverage the CSS or existing JavaScript to do animations. So if you leverage CSS, then you can definitely take advantage of the hardware acceleration. But if you choose to reuse some of the existing jQuery animations, then you can do so too, but you won't get the CSS acceleration. The hardware acceleration. So the answer is yes, it's going to be possible.
When doing end-to-end testing and using the ng mock EDE module, is there a good way to get that DI'd into your application without having to write an alternate app.js or something of the sorts for, like, my version control system, for example? I don't really have a good way to deal with the fact that my app.js is contaminated with all of this mock data and such, as well as having my injection for the ng mock module. Is there a good way to work around that?
I just merged a pull request, I think last week, that allows this. It's not very well documented because we're going to primarily use it in Batarang and another test runner. But if you look into the commit history of AngularJS, it wasn't that I think it was last week or the week before when we added, what is the API called? It's Resume Bootstrap, I believe. So there's a new API called Resume Bootstrap, which allows you to defer the bootstrapping until you load some additional scripts, and then you can say Resume Bootstrap, and you can load extra module into the DI. So and this will allow you to just have your application as is, but load it, pause the bootstrapping, load extra module into the DI system, and then resume it. So look into the commit history. It's definitely something that we wanted to initially use just for ourselves and see how well that works. But if you feel like hacking a little bit, then check it out, and that should make it possible.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Igor, do you have to go? It's after 7:30.
Yes, I have to run.
So thank you.
Okay, guys. Thank you very much.